Welcome to the Savage Executive Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Smith. Whether you're running a company, leading a department, or building your first team, this is where faith-driven leaders come to sharpen. This is wisdom for the weight that you carry. So let's get into it. Most organizations are one leadership departure away from a crisis. The founder steps back and the culture fractures. The senior pastor transitions and the congregation loses half of its momentum. The CEO exits and no one in the building is equipped to make the strategic calls that the role requires. One person leaves and the organization discovers it was never actually an organization. It was one leader with a following. That is not a leadership success story. That is a leadership failure that no one noticed because the leader was still in the building. The discipline of building leaders is one of the most important and one of the most neglected responsibilities of anyone in a senior role. It is neglected for understandable reasons. Developing leaders takes time. It creates ambiguity about authority. And it forces you to invest in people who might eventually leave. It's also neglected for less understandable reasons. It threatens the identity of leaders who have built their significance on being irreplaceable. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The leader who is irreplaceable has not succeeded. They have failed at one of the central responsibilities of leadership. See, the greatest leaders are not the ones who produce the most while they are in the seat. They are the ones who produce leaders who produce more than they ever could alone. So here's the question that I want you to sit with today. When you are no longer in your current role, by choice, by transition, or by circumstance, what leadership capacity will remain? See, that is of your legacy. Not what you built, but who you built. The legacy bench is not built by proximity or tenure. It's built by intention. The leaders who develop other leaders are the ones who have made a deliberate, structured commitment to it. Not the ones who simply hired talented people and hoped leadership would, by osmosis, come from the environment. So let's talk about a few layers in building this into our organizations. Layer one, identify the right candidates. The first discipline of bench building is selection. Not everyone on your team is a candidate for leadership development. And attempting to develop everyone equally is a form of developing no one specifically. You have limited time and attention. It needs to go toward the people with the highest development potential. High development potential is not simply high performance. Some of your best individuals have no interest in leading others, and that's entirely legitimate. The candidates for your legacy bench are the ones who combine strong performance with the desire to grow, the capacity to receive feedback without defensiveness, the temperament to influence others without requiring positional authority, and the evidence, even in the small things, that they think beyond their own responsibilities to the health of the whole organization. In ministry context, I would add that the ones with demonstrated capacity for the weight. Leading in a faith-driven organization requires a kind of resilience that goes beyond professional competence. The person who processes setbacks publicly in destabilizing ways, or who is primarily motivated by recognition, or who folds under sustained pressure, that person may be a gifted contributor, but a poor candidate for leadership succession. So select deliberately. The quality of your legacy bench depends entirely on the quality of your selection. Layer number 2, give stretch assignments before you give titles. The most effective leadership development does not happen in training rooms. It happens in the field, in the actual work of leading, deciding, failing, and recovering. The greatest investment you can make in the next generation leader is real authority over real outcomes with real stakes before they have a formal title that would make failure safe. A stretch assignment is meaningfully beyond the demonstrated capacity. Difficult enough that success is not guaranteed. Manageable enough that failure will not be catastrophic. The right stretch assignment produces growth that no coaching conversation, a book, or a program can ever replicate. It's the lived experience of navigating real responsibility under real pressure. Your role during a stretch assignment is not to manage the outcome. It is to be available for counsel, to debrief honestly after the work is done, and to create the psychological safety for the person to take genuine risks. Leaders who hover over stretch assignments and quietly correct every decision are not developing talent. They are giving someone a front row seat to their own leadership while calling it mentorship. Layer number 3, teach what you know, not just what you do. The most common succession failure that I see in senior leaders is the inability to articulate the principles behind their decisions. They can demonstrate excellent judgment. They make consistently good calls. But the reasoning is inaccessible because it lives in intuition rather than principle. They can show you what they decided. They cannot transfer why. The discipline of teaching next generation leaders requires you to surface what you know at the level of transferable principle. Not just, here is what I decided, but here is how I thought about it. Here are the factors that I weighed. Here is the principle that guided me when the situation was ambiguous. That transfer of reasoning is the engine of leadership, multiplication. Without it, you are producing followers who can execute your decisions. With it, you are producing leaders who can make their own decisions. One practical discipline, after every significant decision that you make, take 15 minutes or so to write down your reasoning in transferable language. Not for a file, but for a conversation. The next development discussion you have with a high potential leader should include that reasoning applied to a situation they are currently navigating. Layer number 4, create visibility, not just access. Next generation leaders need more than your time. They need exposure. They need exposure to the board, to major donors or clients, to the conversations where organizational direction is actually set. Visibility in those contexts accelerates development in ways that one-on-one coaching cannot replicate. Because leadership at the highest levels involves a kind of composure, relational sophistication, and strategic communication that can only be learned in the rooms where those things are required. This is uncomfortable for many senior leaders because it means allowing emerging leaders to be seen in rooms where they may make mistakes. They may ask questions that reveal what they do not know yet, or form impressions in the minds that are not fully informed. The discomfort in this role is the point. You learn to swim in water, not at the edge of the pool. Bring your high potential leaders into strategic conversations earlier than what feels natural. Introduce them to stakeholders before they are fully ready. Let them present in settings where you are present but not leading. The visibility accelerates the development. and it communicates to the next generation leader that you see their future, not just their present. Lastly, layer number 5, plan the succession explicitly. Bench building without succession planning is talent development without a destination. The final layer of the framework is the explicit, honest, ongoing conversation about who is being prepared for what and what the pathway looks like. This conversation is uncomfortable because it surfaces questions that leaders often avoid. What am I preparing to release? Who will the board call when I step down? What would happen to this organization if I were gone tomorrow? The discomfort is proportional to how much of your identity is tied to the position. And that relationship is itself a diagnostic worth examining honestly. Succession planning is not a sign that you are leaving. It is a sign that you are leading responsibly. Every board, every stakeholder, every high potential employee in your organization is quietly asking whether you have thought about this. Your answer, through deliberate bench building, is one of the clearest signals of organizational health that you can send. A few years ago, we experienced something that every organization fears. One of our senior leaders suffered a tragic accident. In an instant, we were facing a reality that many organizations never prepare for. We had responsibilities that couldn't wait, decisions that still had to be made, people who still needed leadership. And the truth was, we didn't have someone fully prepared to step into that level of responsibility. So I stepped in. For a season, I carried responsibilities that weren't originally mine because the organization needed stability while we figured out what came next. What that experience revealed was uncomfortable. We had talented people. We had loyal people. We had experienced people. But we didn't have enough people who had been intentionally developed for the next level of leadership. That's when we began investing differently. There was a teacher on our staff who had been faithfully serving for years. She wasn't campaigning necessarily for a promotion. She wasn't trying to build a title. She was simply doing excellent work where she was. But we saw something in her. We saw potential. So we started giving her opportunities beyond the classroom, additional responsibility, strategic conversations, leadership exposure, stretch assignments. Not because she was ready for the role, because we believe she could become ready for the role. And that's an important distinction. Most leaders look for people who are already prepared. Great leaders look for people who have the capacity to grow into preparation. Over time, she developed the skills, judgment, and confidence required to lead at a much higher level. Today, several years later, she's serving as our school administrator and doing an outstanding job. She's continuing to grow, even pursuing a doctorate degree. The leader our organization needed was there all along. The problem wasn't that we didn't have the person. The problem was that we hadn't developed the person. And one of the lessons that experience taught me is this. If you only value people for the role they're currently filling, you'll often miss the leader that they're capable of becoming. We could have kept her in the classroom for years. She was a great teacher, but she wasn't only made to teach, she was made to lead. And our responsibility as leaders is not simply to fill today's positions, it's to prepare tomorrow's leaders before tomorrow arrives. That experience changed the way that we think about succession entirely. Today, we don't just have long-range succession plans. We also have emergency succession plans. In fact, for our senior pastor, there is a sealed envelope approved by our board that outlines exactly what happens if a tragedy occurs tomorrow. Not because we're expecting one, but because responsible leaders prepare for realities they hope never happen. We learned that succession planning isn't about replacing people. It's about protecting the mission. And the best succession plans don't start when someone leaves. They start years earlier when you begin building the leaders who will one day carry the weight. There is a theological dimension to legacy bench building. Every leader that you develop is a stewardship act. The gifts, the capacity, the wisdom, and the experience that God has built in you over decades of leadership, those are not yours to keep. They are yours to invest. The faithful steward multiplies what has been entrusted to them. The unfaithful steward buries it. When you develop a next generation leader, when you share the reasonings, your decisions, when you give them the stretch assignments they are not fully ready for, when you bring them into the room before it is comfortable, you are multiplying the return on everything that God has invested in you. The impact is not just additive, it is exponential, because the leaders that you develop will develop leaders of their own. That is multiplication, and is one of the most faithful things a senior leader can do with the gifts that they have been given. Here's the savage takeaway for today. The true measure of your leadership is not what you built. It is who you built and whether they are ready to carry it forward. What we just unpacked is the discipline of multiplication, one of the 5 disciplines inside the Savage Advantage Playbook. Addition builds output. Multiplication builds legacy. Every leader will eventually transition by choice, by circumstance, or by time. The question is not whether your season ends. The question is what you leave behind. Build leaders who will multiply what you started. That is the legacy worth building. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, Paul is speaking to Timothy and he says this, "And the things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men, who shall be able to teach others also." Paul writes this to Timothy from prison, near the end of his life. The urgency is unmistakable. Commit what you have received to people who can pass it on. The multiplication model is explicit. 4 generations of transfer in a single verse. Paul to Timothy, to faithful men, to others. Notice what Paul calls for. Faithful individuals. The ones who can be trusted with what is being given. Who will steward it well. Build on it and pass it on rather than hoarding it or diluting it. Faithfulness is the qualifying criterion. Talent is secondary. This week, identify your top 2 legacy bench candidates. Again, not who is most loyal, but who has the highest development potential. For each one, name one stretch assignment that you could give them in the next 30 days. One conversation you need to have about their pathway, and one room that you need to bring them into that you have been keeping to yourself. Write all of that down. Then make the first move this week. Here's the diagnostic question from the Savage Advantage Playbook for this discipline. If you stepped away for 30 days, what would stop and what would scale? Take that question seriously this week. Write your answer down. It'll tell you more about the health of your organization than most assessments ever will. And if you would like access to the Savage Advantage Playbook, it is 5 disciplines with real diagnostics and a 30-day path to put the framework to work in your context. It is the foundation of everything that we teach here at Savagey at savageexecutive.com. If this episode sharpened your thinking, can I encourage you to share it with one leader who needs it this week? Subscribe so you never miss an episode. Connect with me on LinkedIn or on Instagram at Savage Executive. Next week will be the Season 2 finale. We're wrapping all 5 disciplines of the Savage Advantage, celebrating everything that we've covered this season and giving you a 30-day integration challenge to take it all off the podcast and into your organization. That's next week. This is the Savage Executive. I'm Steve Smith. Can I encourage you, lead with excellence, steward with faithfulness, and carry the weight with grace.